Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation, an agency of the federal government established by Congress to improve teaching about the United States Constitution.
Well, you've brought us into the present, and so I'm going to take the initiative and ask you a dangerous question, and you can refuse to answer it if you like, but if we could somehow resuscitate the founders and bring them back, bring this cast of characters that you chronicle so well back, and they were to look at political parties today, do you think they would say, why on earth do you have these two great factions when we warned you so sternly against them? Of course, Washington gives the sternest warning of all against political parties in his farewell address, and especially the basing of them, he says, on geographical differences. So would you be willing to make a sort of speculative answer to that question? Would the founders think we had institutionalized extra-constitutionally factions today, which are always bad, by the way, in their vocabulary? Factions are always bad.
I think they would be appalled at the nature of politics today. And it wouldn't be simply partisanship. And they probably, if Jefferson was one who was rarely really honest with himself. Because Jefferson was the prime mover in all of this stuff, and he was the most critical of partisan politics. But of course, it's partisanship when the other side does it. It's not partisanship when your side does it. And that was true back then, and it's true today. And how much of this is simply sort of cynical rhetoric, where you know it's not true, but you feel obliged to say it? And how much of it is self-deception is kind of hard to say. Jefferson was a very subtle thinker, and so he could talk himself into all sorts of things. I think Madison was a little bit clearer about this. And there's a really interesting transformation in Madison where he begins by saying that factions are these terrible things that have to be kept under control. Now, he is really speaking of what will become parties, but that term isn't in common use in those days. But within 3 or 4 years, he's saying that not only are these inevitable, but in fact, they're a good thing. And so, but again, it's his faction that's a good thing. Because, of course, each side feels beleaguered and disadvantaged with respect to the other side. And all we're doing is defending the public interest against the depredations of this other side. So this kind of approach to politics, this kind of interpretation to politics, it goes back to the very beginning. But I do caution my students, myself, other people, of bringing people from the past to the present. Because in the first place, I think they would be astonished and quite possibly dismayed that we are still operating under the Constitution they wrote over 200 years ago. Because, they created a new country, they wrote constitutions for every state, they wrote a couple of constitutions for the United States, and that was all within 15 years. And now we're stuck on the same one that they wrote. Have we no imagination? And the fact that it has been amended as seldom as it has. Jefferson reflected on this whole question of whether a constitution written in 1787 would bind people living in 1820. And he concluded that in fact, if you really believe in self-government, then law, statutes, and constitutions as well should probably go out of existence after a given time. Because just as the Americans had said to King George and the British, we will not be governed by you, then Americans who were the grandchildren of Jefferson and Washington and those, to think that they should be governed by people who had lived 2 generations before, that was just as nonsensical. That was just as opposed to the idea of self-government. Now, turned out that became unworkable to rewrite everything every generation. But the other thing
Which
was...
Madison pointed out to Jefferson, which was often his role. And I think, if I recall, Jefferson concluded it was every 20 years because that's every generation should give its consent to that.
Yeah.
But Madison's role was often to sort of bring Jefferson back down to earth.
Exactly, especially. Jefferson goes beyond that in saying that, a revolution every so often is a pretty good idea too. And but one of the things that they didn't foresee, well, first of all, they didn't foresee that the small country for which they wrote this Constitution would become a country of 330 million people, and it would span the entire North American continent, and that it would have interests around the globe. So the scale of operations of the government would have, I suppose, in one sense, they would have been proud of what they accomplished. They created this great country, the great country that came to, if not dominate world affairs, but to lead world affairs in many ways. So they were all proud that they had contributed to American independence, and so the country was great and was going well. They all feared that the country would fall apart, and it hasn't fallen apart. There was a moment in the 1860s where it did, but it was knit back together. So they would be pleased with that, but I think they would feel, what actually very many people today feel, that the extra constitutional parts of our political culture, our system, starting with political parties, have kind of run away with the spirit of the Constitution. Now, they intended the Constitution, as they wrote it, to be really, it was no blueprint, it was really an outline, it was a suggestion. These are the basic principles. They knew, and they discovered right away, that, okay, you got to figure out how to organize Congress. Who determines what goes on the agenda? What gets voted on first? So the Houses of Congress will make their own rules. They didn't think seriously about how candidates for office were going to be recruited, in part because they lived at a time when everybody in politics knew everybody else. And so you didn't have to have a sifting the way we do with primaries and people, who sort of come out of nowhere and enter politics. So I think if they came back today, they would have been pleased that this operation, the ship of state that they set in motion, was still sailing, it hadn't sunk. But they would have sort of scratched their heads and say, where's the initiative? Where's the boldness that we showed? Where is that today? Why, if you argue about things like debt ceilings, for instance, or the meaning of the Second Amendment, well, if you can't agree, rewrite the damn thing. That's what you're supposed to do. But they underestimated the degree to which once institutions are created, they come to have lives of their own. And they didn't deal with that at all. I mean, they actually did deal with it in the case of Parliament, which had a life of its own, and it had politics and practices and so on, and that's what they rejected. But they ended up creating something very much like Parliament. And that part probably would have discouraged them.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.